in southern England, particularly where I live in Dorset, there are 4 main types of pine, and I'm going to show you how to tell the difference between those 4 species. And I'm doing that by introducing you to a reference species, the one that you're most likely to meet, which is Scots pine. And the easiest way to identify Scots pine is to look at the upper trunk. The top of the stem should have orange coloration all the way through like this, and that is a very good way of identifying Scots pine. But to make sure, I always look at the size of the cones and the arrangement of the needles. These are the cones, and you can see they're just 5 centimeters or so in size, both in height and width. That's about 2 inches. And also it's a similar size for the needles, and the needles are in 2s, in pairs on each needle bud. And there's also often a little bit of a blue tinge to the green, and so I look for those features to support the fact that I'm looking at a tree with orange bark. And when I see them, I know I'm looking at a Scots pine. But what if you don't see that orange bark? Well, then I look to the cones and see if I can see some of them. And if I see cones that are about the same size as Scots pines, like these, but the bark is not orange, it's more grey and slightly brown, then I think I'm looking at a black pine. And if I can find some needles, then I check the needles to see what arrangement they are in. And if they are in 2s, like this, but they're a little bit, they're not exactly floppy, but they're not thick and robust looking, and quite often they're twisted, then these signs are telling me I'm looking at a black pine. So that's how I distinguish between Scots pine and black pine. But what if there aren't these small cones? What if the cones are much bigger, like this? Well, we can see that these are very different cones, and they're the same rough shape, but they're much bigger. When I hold this one, that fills my fist. And you'll also notice possibly that there are little prickles on each of these bracts, and that's a helpful sign as well, because this is the maritime pine. If we look at the needles, we can see it's still got 2 needles for each needle bud, and they are a little bit twisted, but they are much more thick and sturdy looking, and they're longer than the black pine. You can see that by comparing the width of my hand with the needle length. So those features together are telling me that this is a maritime pine. And usually you see cones in the maritime pines in pairs at the tips of branches, and they can stay there for quite some time, for quite a few years, and then you might find some a little bit further back along the branch, but generally they're out towards the tips of the branches. But what then if we see a tree that looks a bit like this, but it has loads and loads of cones in it that are all just hanging in there, making each branch look a bit knobbly? Well then, if we're looking at this sort of arrangement, and if I feel these cones, they don't have that prickle, then we are looking here at a Monterey pine. And to confirm that, I look at the needles and I see that instead of that, you have to look at quite a few needles to get the hang of whether it's a 2 needle or a 3 needle or even a 5 needle pine. And here we can see we've got a 3 needle needle bud, and that's telling me that it can't be a maritime pine, because maritime pine has needles in pairs. So that is a very good indicator that we're looking at Monterey pine as well. And you'll also notice that these needles are not as long or as sturdy as for the maritime pine. So that's how I figure out which pine we're looking at. Start with a Scots pine and then work your way through these 4 species.